you ask me to name one of my favorite games of all time and one that had a massive impact on the gaming industry, I point you straight to the original Resident Evil 4. Not only did it reignite interest in the horror genre, it also completely redefined how we approach action horror, all while keeping the gameplay fast-paced, fluid, and fun. Since its release in 2005, we've seen very few true successors to the third-person survival horror experience it perfected, Cronos being no exception. Unfortunately, Cronos falls into the same trap as many other modern titles, chasing industry trends at the cost of originality. It delivers a largely uninspired gameplay experience, and it's not the only game guilty of this. Stock Bloober Team has yet to prove they're capable of creating something truly original. They made a career out of emulating others rather than carving out a unique identity. They haven't released a single game that sets them apart from their peers. Cronos feels like an amalgamation of other games' intellectual properties and half-baked ideas. It never fully commits to anything it tries to do. Many of its mechanics feel borrowed, yet it brings almost nothing new to the table. But first, it's important to understand the developers behind the game. Bloober Team is a Polish studio best known for its psychological horror titles like Layers of Fear, Observer, The Medium, and recently the Silent Hill 2 remake. They first gained moderate fame with Layers of Fear, which many consider to be a derivative of PT, was generating major buzz at the time. That game was heavily promoted by streamers.
His 6-year-old daughter had the good sense to hide in the bathroom.
Perhaps the most serious criticism involves how they handle mental health and trauma. These sensitive topics are often used as window dressing or shock value rather than being treated with nuance or care. The Medium and Layers of Fear have been criticized for using mental illness in a way that feels reductive or even exploitative. Instead of deepening the horror, these depictions can come off as tone-deaf or harmful, turning serious real-world struggles into little more than horror tropes. That's not the only controversial moment in Bloober Team's history. While working on The Medium, the studio filed and was granted a patent for a game mechanic involving simultaneous world simulation, a feature central to that title. To this day, they still hold the patent. What makes this more particularly contentious is how they responded to criticism. When initially called out, Bloober Team denied any wrongdoing. However, in an interview, Tomasz Gałkowski, the studio chief's marketing officer, admitted that if companies like Activision or Sony wanted to use a similar mechanic, they would need to seek Bloober Team's permission. In the world of game design, certain ideas are considered too broad or foundational to be monopolized. Mechanics like dual world rendering can be interpreted and implemented in countless ways by different developers. Citing such a concept limits creative freedom and innovation, especially when the core idea isn't exactly groundbreaking. Frankly, it's a scummy move, and it's surprising how little attention it still gets. Bloober Team frequently attempts to explore mature and psychologically complex themes, but their execution often falls short. Stories tend to be convoluted, emotionally hollow, or overly melodramatic. Characters are underdeveloped, twists feel forced, and storytelling relies too heavily on vague symbolism or horror cliches rather than coherent writing. This often leaves the player disconnected from the narrative, with stories that promise emotional weight but fail to deliver. And not to mention the censorship controversy in Silent Hill 2 Remake. Fans noticed that both Maria and Angela have been visually toned down, and not just for style. Maria, who originally had a provocative sexualized look that symbolized James' repressed desires, now wears a much more conservative outfit. That change might seem small, but it weakens the psychological contracts that made her so important. Angela's design also feels softened. In the original, she looked and sounded visibly traumatized. That discomfort was crucial to her character. The remake gives her a cleaner, more stable look, and fans argue it dulls the emotional weight of her story. Bloober Team claims the changes are just modern updates, not censorship, but it is self-censorship. A shift to make things safer for modern audiences. And when you're remaking a game built entirely on psychological discomfort, toning things down isn't just cosmetic, it's rewriting the message. But don't just take my word for it. Check the link in the description for a deep dive into the full history of Bloober Team and their more questionable decisions. Despite working in the same genre across multiple games, Bloober Team has shown very little interest in evolving its designs, mechanics, themes, and narrative structures are reused with minimal variation. The studio leans heavily on aesthetics, moody lighting, surreal imagery, and eerie soundscapes, but offer little substance beneath the surface. Another common issue is pacing. Bloober Team's games are often feel padded, with repetitive gameplay segments and overuse of environmental storytelling that drags the experience down. Rather than escalating tension or build dread, they tend to meander, causing scares to lose their impact due to predictability. Let's talk about why the gameplay, and even in terms of horror, atmosphere, monsters, and characters, Cronos: The New Dawn just doesn't work, and why it might be one of the most disappointing horror entries this year. Most of their titles follow the same basic gameplay look, walking through eerie environments, reading scattered notes, solving overly simplistic puzzles, and dodging poorly implemented enemies. These mechanics are rarely improved upon or meaningfully iterated, which leads to a sense of mechanical stagnation. Everything I said about Bloober Team and the shortcomings in horror game design isn't exclusive to them. Alan Wake 2 made many of the same mistakes, primarily by mimicking the gameplay style of the Resident Evil 2 remake, which was extremely popular at the time of its release. Even the original Alan Wake was heavily influenced by the framework established in Resident Evil 4. This trend of borrowing from successful titles isn't new, but the problem lies in understanding why the older games worked so well in the first place. I actually made a video about Alan Wake 2 nearly 2 years ago, and every criticism I had about that game still applies here. The core issue is that many modern horror games try to emulate what Resident Evil 4 accomplished, but they often fail in execution, mainly because they don't grasp the design philosophy that made those games so engaging, immersive, and timeless. The best example of a game that took inspiration from Resident Evil 4 and successfully built upon its ideas is the original Dead Space. While some might say it operates on the same framework, the developers analyzed what worked and what didn't in RE4 and iterated on it, making something better. Everything in Dead Space feels like an evolution of that core concept. In Cronos, there is a noticeable lack of variety when it comes to enemy types, weapon options, and tactical approaches to encounters. Compare this to a game like Resident Evil 4, the combat feels dynamic and reactive. You can shoot enemies in specific body parts to stun or stagger them, allowing you to close the gap and perform melee, sometimes even executing iconic moves like the suplex. This mechanic encourages players to think critically about how they engage enemies and rewards precision. In Dead Space, the combat philosophy is entirely different but equally compelling. Headshots aren't effective against necromorphs, forcing players to adopt a defensive strategic approach that prioritizes dismemberment. Severing limbs is the key to survival. Additionally, tools like telekinesis and stasis introduce environmental interactions and timing-based strategy into combat, giving players creative ways to conserve ammo and control the encounter. Unfortunately, Cronos falls short in these areas. Enemy behavior is overly simplistic, and combat encounters lack the depth or tension seen in more refined action horror games. Even on higher difficulty settings, it is often possible to simply run around enemies and avoid damage altogether. This undermines the sense of danger and makes the combat feel like an afterthought rather than a core pillar of the experience. Furthermore, the encounter spaces themselves are poorly designed initially, and this can be frustrating due to awkward layouts and limited player options. However, once you begin to understand the limitations and predictable patterns in the enemy AI, these frustrations fade, not because the game gets better, but it becomes too easy to exploit. What initially feels like a challenge quickly becomes a routine, robbing the game of any lasting sense of tension or engagement. Since this is a sci-fi game that clearly draws heavy inspiration from titles like the Callisto Protocol and Dead Space, I expected the gunplay to be much more involved. Unfortunately, the game only gives you 4 guns to work with. I'm not even going to count the alternative fire modes as separate weapons because frankly they're underwhelming, especially after you fully upgrade them. The variations feel more like gimmicks than meaningful upgrades. Before I go deeper, I want to make something very clear. When you take inspirations from games like Resident Evil 4 or Dead Space, you're drawing from titles that revolutionize how shooting mechanics work in horror games. One of the key elements in those games was the use of laser sights, and it wasn't just for style. The laser sights serve as a real mechanical purpose: precision shooting. The beauty of these systems was that your bullets went exactly where you aimed. No spread, no randomness, even when you were moving. You had complete control over where your shots landed. That consistency is part of what made the combat in those games feel so tight and rewarding. You always knew that if you missed a shot, it was your fault, not the game's. And this isn't a relic of the past either. Games have been doing this for well over 20 years. Resident Evil 4 nailed it back in 2005. Even Cold Fear, which came out 5 months before RE4, had a similar system. More recently, Crow Country, an indie game, managed to bring the same tight, focused shooting to a modern audience. So here's the thing. If you're going to borrow, then borrow the right things. Steal the good ideas. This isn't some complicated next-gen mechanic where talking about. It's a simple design choice that stood the test of time for a reason. The problem with modern horror games is gun bloom, aka artificial bullet spread. This is how some developers try to make shooting feel harder without actually designing smarter enemy behavior or more interesting scenarios. It creates a false sense of challenge because sometimes your bullets just won't go where you aimed, even if your crosshair is dead on. And the alt-fire mechanics of most of these guns, like I mentioned, are from the base gun. You generally have two firing modes in the game. Either you charge your shots for higher impact or shoot continuously for rapid fire. That's essentially the core mechanic across most weapons. Starting with the pistol, it features a standard powerful single shot that you can charge up or a rapid fire mode that you get later. The charged shot deals significant more damage, making it useful for tougher enemies or precision hits. The carbine also supports charged shots, including a variant that fires a triple shot burst when fully charged. Alternatively, you can hold down the trigger for a continuous automatic fire until the magazine is empty, which is great for sustained damage. The shotgun has two main options. You can charge up for a more powerful blast or use a double barrel configuration that fires both shells at once for massive close range damage. It's ideal for crowd control or finishing off enemies quickly. Lastly, there's the arbalist. At first, it seemed like it would function like a marksman rifle, precise with high damage. However, it actually shoots black hole projectiles, making it much more exotic. It only holds one shot per chamber, but you can upgrade it later for more capacity. When you look at games like Dead Space, one of the standout elements is how the weapons are designed around the game's setting. Most of the weapons are actually repurposed mining tools, which give their functionality and alternate fire modes a unique flavor that feels authentic to the world. Each alt-fire mode isn't just a gimmick, it reflects the makeshift nature of these tools being turned into survival weapons. The only conventional weapon in Dead Space is a pulse rifle, and even its alternate fire is interesting. It shoots a barrage in a 360-degree spread, essentially a last resort panic button that feels like a desperate close quarters defense mechanism. Now compare that to a game that wants to feel sci-fi, let's say this new one, where weapons seem to materialize out of thin air. Some of them can even switch between melee forms, like a knuckle duster and raged gun mode. On paper, that sounds futuristic and cool, but in practice, there's a disconnect. The weapons like the carbine, shotgun, and arbalest all take up individual slots in your inventory. Each has limited ammo and consumes precious space, which forces the player to make trade-offs, but not in a satisfying strategic way. The system becomes frustrating when trying to react quickly to different combat situations. There's no clear synergy between weapon choice and enemy type. And since ammo is scarce and storage is limited, it discourages experimentation. It feels more like a burden than an empowering tactical choice. If the game wants to fully embrace its sci-fi identity, it should go beyond just flashy weapon transformations, give players something unique, like time manipulation or other physics-based mechanics. That fundamentally changes how combat plays out. Let them engage creatively, not just damage per second calculation. Ultimately, however, the gameplay tends to push players towards the same familiar loop: maximize headshot damage and conserve ammo. So despite the futuristic wrapping, combat can end up feeling formulaic. As for melee, it borrows from Dead Space again. There's a basic stomp and punch mechanic, but here it lacks impact. It doesn't do damage and rarely feels satisfying. A good comparison is a game like Samurai Unicorn. In that game, they attempted to integrate melee into the core loop. While it still didn't do massive damage, it had a purpose. It could stagger enemies, opening them up for follow-up shots. That creates a rhythm, a reason to mix melee and ranged combat. In this new game, melee feels like an afterthought. I'm not saying developers need to go full Callisto Protocol and implement a melee system so oversimplified that it automates the gameplay and removes any real sense of skill. However, game designers also shouldn't keep avoiding the inclusion of well-crafted melee mechanics just because they think it reduces the tension in horror games. In reality, a solid melee system can actually enhance immersion, making the horror feel more immediate and personal, rather than turning every close encounter into a clunky or frustrating experience. It exists, but it doesn't contribute meaningfully to combat flow. If developers want melee to matter, they should look at how it can complement gunplay, rather than just exist alongside it. As you progress, you gain access to two additional utility tools. While they aren't as powerful or versatile as the telekinesis or stasis modules, they still have situational value. The first is a flamethrower, though it doesn't function like a traditional flamethrower. Instead of emitting a continuous stream of fire, it deals damage in a short range area of effect. It's most useful when you're grabbed by enemies or when you need to push back multiple enemies quickly. In addition to dealing damage, it also stuns enemies, making them vulnerable and easy targets for follow-up headshots. The second tool is a proximity mine that you can throw, functioning like a remote explosive. When triggered, it causes an explosion that sets enemies on fire, adding both crowd control and area denial potential. However, both of these tools are more situational compared to your core abilities. Because of this, and especially if you're confident in your gunplay, It's easy to forget about these utilities altogether. They can be effective in the right circumstances, but they're not essential to rely on unless the situation demanded. And I almost forgot to mention this. The health sensor or scanner is an add-on. When you aim your gun at an enemy, it displays a color-coded health indicator, green, yellow, and red. It also helps you identify which corpses are truly dead versus those that are merely lying in wait. However, this functions as a double-edged sword, conditioning the player to aim at every corpse they see and preemptively shoot it before it can react, ultimately reducing suspense. Here's a free design idea the Bloober Team is welcome to steal for the sequel. When enemies are dismembered or when the orphans attempt to absorb corpses scattered around the arena, the orphans can absorb them and transform into entirely new enemy types with different traits, behaviors, or abilities. For example, consuming a fast, agile enemy could make the orphan quicker, more evasive, or capable of hit-and-run tactics. This mechanic would introduce a layer of unpredictability and strategic tension into each encounter. Not only would this make combat more dynamic, it would also deepen the sense of horror and pressure as every fallen foe becomes a potential catalyst for something far more worse. In Dead Space, AI spawning is controlled by a system called the AI Director. It dynamically spawns enemies based on your health, ammo, and location to keep tension high. Instead of fixed enemy placement, it uses spawn zones and triggers to generate threats when you backtrack or linger too long. Also, in encounters, when one enemy is spawned in front of you, another is spawned behind you that you're not even aware of, keeping you on your toes. This creates a feeling of unpredictability and constant danger, even in areas you thought you were safe. Now let's move on to the story. I'm going to deep dive into the plot, including all major story points, key characters, and multiple possible endings, along with what each one means. So fair warning, major spoilers hit. If you rather avoid spoilers and want to skip straight to the next section, now's the time to do so. The game unfolds across two distinct temporal settings: a post-apocalyptic future and a 1980s era Poland, specifically inspired by the Nowa Huta district in Krakow. At the heart of the story lies a cataclysmic event known only as the Change. This mysterious catastrophe has transformed much of humanity into grotesque mutated entities called orphans. These creatures possess the unique ability to merge with one another, increasing their strength and becoming exponentially more dangerous. Players assume the role of the Traveler, ND-3576, an operative deployed by a secret organization known as the Collective. The Traveler's mission is to utilize time rifts to travel back to the 1980s, a time before the change took full effect, in order to retrieve the essences of those who perished. We never see the Traveler take off her helmet or learn who she truly is until the very end of the game. This creates a significant disconnect between the player and the character. It's difficult to form any emotional bond with someone who remains faceless and expressionless throughout the experience. In contrast, even Isaac in the original Dead Space is shown without his helmet at the beginning and at the end. That simple visual cue reminds us that there's a real person behind the suit, a human with emotions, fears, and motivations. With the Traveler, however, we get none of that. Her dialogue is monotone and emotionally flat, which makes it hard to gauge her thoughts or feelings during critical story moments or when encountering other human characters. So this makes it hard to connect with any of the characters or even follow what is going on. But our overall objective, extracting essences. These essences are not mere memories or digital echoes, but integral aspects of a person's being, capable of being brought forth into the future, preserving humanity's remnants in a new form. During key story moments, when you upload these essences into a machine called a terminal, the game shifts into a mental space filled with a red background and surrounded by towering black obelisks. This visual design is clearly an intentional aesthetic choice, seemingly inspired by the surreal symbolic sequences from Signalis, where critical plot points involving Elster are conveyed through similar haunting imagery. However, unlike Signalis, this game never explains why these sequences occur or what their narrative significance is. The aesthetic feels hollow, copied for style rather than substance. There's no deeper context given for the red void or the obelisk, nor is there any payoff for the repeated trips into this mental space. To make matters worse, these cutscenes drag on far too long. Every time I returned to the terminal, I was forced to sit through another lengthy cryptic sequence that added little to the story and interrupted the pacing. Eventually, I got so frustrated I ended up downloading a better game just to escape the monotony. Honestly, can you blame me?
Women.
As for a gameplay standpoint, they also offer passive buffs depending on which essence you have equipped. You can only have 3 at any given time, but deleting story important essences have no impact on anything at all. I don't understand why we can't just store these essences in our inventory for later runs or different builds to allow more variety. Anyway, moving on. Throughout the game, the Traveler is guided by a central hub overseen by the Warden, a character responsible for maintaining the terminal, a facility critical for navigating time rifts and handling essences. One of the game's emotional cores is the relation between the Traveler and Veronica, a woman from the past whose fate becomes increasingly central to the narrative. The story intensifies when the Traveler encounters the Pathfinder, another agent that's connected to the Collective. By the way, we never meet the Collective. We don't know if it's a person, a group, an AI, an organization. Once again, we encounter Bloober Team's vague storytelling, but it's never really expanded on. The big twist is the Traveler you play as ND3576 is actually carrying the essence of Veronica, whose consciousness was preserved after her body failed. Throughout the game, you think you're working for the Collective, extracting essences and fixing timelines, but slowly it's revealed that these missions are part of a deeper plan by the Pathfinder, secretly the Warden, to bring back Veronica. These memories, visions, and emotional reactions you experience are fragments of Veronica surfacing within you. So in the end, you're not just a nameless agent, you are Veronica, reborn in another's body, and your journey becomes one of reclaiming identity, breaking cycles, and deciding whether to repeat the past or start anew. Players are ultimately faced with the critical choice: spare or kill the Pathfinder. If the Traveler spares the Pathfinder, both the Pathfinder and Veronica are brought to the future. However, Veronica's memories have been damaged in the process, and she begins to mutate into an orphan. The Pathfinder is then forced to extract her essence, causing the cycle to begin anew. Alternatively, if the Traveler kills the Pathfinder, she uses his advanced technology to send Veronica back in time, just before the change begins. In a haunting twist, Veronica is revealed to be infected, carrying the change within her. This revelation implies a paradox. Trying to save her, the Traveler may have inadvertently perpetuated the catastrophe.
Why would he even care? I am your past, damn it! You could just go away and be free.
I am free. We all are.
Edward! Open up, Edward! Open up! Please! Oh, thank God!
Veronica? Hey, it's all right. What's going on?
I just didn't want to be alone.
In New Game Plus mode, which introduces a true ending, this suggests that the traveler has already lived through these events multiple times. The cycle, the Veronica's extraction, the conflict with the Pathfinder, her infection, repeats endlessly. However, in this final loop, the Pathfinder attempts to break the cycle by taking responsibility and working with the traveler to send both Veronica and the traveler to the rift together.
I can't let you do this.
She must be saved.
Why would you even care? I am your past, damn it! You could just go away and
Be free.
What?
It already happened. It's happening all over again. Somehow, it always ends here.
Maybe you should be free from all the scars. And most importantly, free from me.
I won't leave you.
It's fine, Veronica. Maybe she's right. Go. Take her. There's still a chance for both of you.
Will it work?
You never give up. You'll make it work.
Welcome, Veronica. It's time.
The closing scene is ambiguous. The traveler is seen awaking someone, presumably Veronica, from a traveler pod. Has the loop truly been broken, or is it simply beginning again? In the end, everything you do feels utterly meaningless. Very little is ever truly resolved, and you're left with more questions than answers. Once again, Bloober Team's notoriously vague storytelling rears its ugly head, prioritizing cryptic symbolism over coherent narrative structures. We are never told who or what the collective actually is. Despite numerous murals depicting other travelers removing their helmets, we never get to see the face of our traveler. similar. Why the deliberate withholding of such a basic narrative payoff? It feels less like an artistic choice and more like a refusal to commit to anything concrete. Then there's the Pathfinder. What exactly did he do to change his mind? Critical plot points are barely touched upon, let alone explained. Instead of diving into the consequences of his actions or giving us insights into his motivations, story glosses over everything with metaphor and ambiguity. The so-called change is described as a flesh-consuming disease, yet throughout the world we encounter objects floating in midair, gravity behaving erratic, and architecture twisted in physically impossible ways. None of this is ever explained. Is it a side effect of the disease, a breakdown of reality, a metaphor? Who knows? The game certainly doesn't tell us. Despite introducing time manipulation mechanics, they're barely utilized in any meaningful way. Choices you make during dialogue segments have little to no impact on the actual story, and the endings are reduced to two binary options. There's no nuance, no culmination of player choice, just a frustratingly opaque conclusion masquerading as something deep and profound. In the end, it all feels like a missed opportunity, a world full of potential drowned in ambiguity for the sake of seeming philosophical. Instead of inviting interpretation, it pushes players away with its refusal to say anything definitive. One of the core pillars of any horror game is its enemies, not just in terms of design, but how they behave, challenge the player, and evolve throughout the experience. In Cronos, enemy encounters are built around a certain gimmick. Monsters can merge with fallen bodies to become more powerful, requiring players to target specific weak spots to defeat them. While this concept initially appears to introduce a tactical layer to combat, its actual implementation undermines player engagement. The primary issue lies in the behavior of the AI. Instead of responding dynamically to the player, enemies often ignore them altogether, focusing instead on absorbing nearby corpses. This results in numerous combat encounters where enemies turn their backs on the player mid-fight to perform this merging animation, rendering them passive and predictable. What should feel like an escalating threat ends up feeling like a repetitive shooting gallery, as the enemies prioritized are skewed in a way that breaks immersion and diminishes tension. The second major flaw is the AI's broken pathfinding. Enemies frequently get stuck in the environment, wander aimlessly, or fail to properly navigate towards the player. This technical limitation further weakens combat encounters, stripping them of urgency and turning supposedly horrifying monsters into easy targets. make matters worse, Cronos borrows many of its enemy archetypes from Callisto Protocol with minimal changes to their behavior or design. Familiar enemies like the Bloodworm, Rusher, and Big Math are essentially lifted from that title, contributed to a pervasive sense that Cronos is less interested in creating something new and more invested in recycling ideas from other games. Boss fights in Cronos continue the trend of unoriginal design and lackluster execution. While the game technically includes 6 bosses, only 4 of them are unique, with the remaining 2 serving as reskins of previous battles. These fights often rely on the same mechanic, shooting the glowing weak spots. This design trope, while serviceable in moderation, becomes tedious and uninspired when used in nearly every boss encounter. The first boss fight is an amalgamation of Slenderman and the Ouroboros creature from Resident Evil 5, including the same exact method of targeting illuminated body parts. The second boss features a tank-like enemy where the player simply runs around the arena and shoots red canisters, a tired mechanic seen in countless other games. The third boss is quite literally a combination of the previous 2, offering no new challenge or variation. The Eliza boss fight, located in a church, is a grotesque amalgamation of bodies but still relies on the same glowing weak point formula. Only one boss, the Pathfinder, shows a spark of originality. This late game encounter introduces gravity shifting mechanics established earlier in the game, creating a fight that feels mechanically integrated with the world and narrative. It is the one moment where Cronos suggests a deeper design ambition. Sadly, this lone exception only highlights how underdeveloped the other encounters are. Overall, the bosses serve little purpose beyond extending the game's runtime. They lack mechanical depth, visual variety, and narrative relevance. The only compliment that can be afforded is that they are not reduced to static PNG jump scares as seen in Alan Wake 2, but this is an exceedingly low bar to clear. A strong user interface and thoughtful level design are essential for player immersion, particularly in horror games where environmental storytelling plays a central role. Cronos, however, stumbles in both areas. The game's UI designs feel disconnected from the world it is set in, while there are other moments where graffiti or environmental text appear on the player's HUD. This idea is underutilized and never expanded upon. Had the developers adopted a diegetic UI similar to that of Dead Space, where health objectives and navigation tools are integrated directly into the character's suit or environment, it could have elevated the sense of immersion significantly. The interface remains functionally basic and lacks the polish or creativity to stand out. Visibility is another pressing issue. Darkness is a common tool in horror, but it must be balanced with gameplay readability. In Cronos, overly dark environments obscure important visual cues, even crates marked with yellow paint. Yes, they copied the crates marked by yellow paint straight from RE4 Remake. Pathetic fucking idiots. Anyways, they are meant to guide players towards resources or progression paths. These are often quite impossible to see. This turns exploration into a frustrating chore rather than an engaging activity. Games like Dead Space solve with the subtle lighting cues. Blue glows on interactable objects, for example, allowing players to feel challenged without visually being impaired. Level design suffers from similar shortcomings. Many of the environments feel cramped, difficult to navigate, and aesthetically redundant. Players will often struggle to identify passable areas due to poor signposting and inconsistent environmental language. Most locations are abandoned apartments, factories, and crypts, lack any sort of visual or thematic variety, blending together into a monotonous backdrop. One of the very few bright spots is a brief going back to the 1980s section of Poland, which introduced a distinct atmosphere and tone. Similarly, Clock Tower sequence at the end of the game is visually engaging and shows more creativity in design. Unfortunately, these moments are short-lived and underutilized, further emphasizing the wasted potential seen throughout the game. Cronos is a game that clearly aspires to join the ranks of genre-defining horror titles, yet it consistently fails to meet even the basic standard set by its inspirations. Its enemy design is shallow and repetitive, its AI behavior undermines the core combat loop, and its boss fights lack creativity or challenge. The user interface is functional but uninspired, while the level design is both visually bland and mechanically frustrating. There are glimpses of good ideas, a merging enemy system, a gravity mechanic, but these are overshadowed by poor execution and a reliance on borrowed concepts. Ultimately, Cronos feels like a patchwork of other horror games stitched together without a clear vision or identity of its own. It's a cautionary tale in game design. Inspiration without innovation results in mediocrity. While not without its moments, Cronos fails to deliver a cohesive or memorable horror experience. In the realm of survival horror games, gameplay design must walk a delicate line between engaging combat mechanics, intelligent enemy behavior, and immersive world building. Titles such as Resident Evil 4, Dead Space, and Alan Wake have successfully established unique gameplay loops that complement complement their horror aesthetics and create a lasting impact. Unfortunately, Cronos, a recent addition to the genre, struggles to carve out its own identity. The primary purpose of this video is to highlight the major flaws present in many modern horror games. At the forefront of this issue is Bloober Team. Despite being hailed as masters of horror, Bloober Team has yet to produce anything that truly innovates or feels uniquely their own. Their work often feels recycled from familiar tropes without offering a distinct creative identity. I'll be honest, I actually found myself enjoying the game more during my second playthrough in New Game Plus, with the upgraded stats, weapons, and resources carried over from my initial run. When I started approaching the game more like a third-person shooter rather than a methodical experience it seemed to originally be intended for. The fact that I was able to engage with the game in a way that diverged so significantly from the developer's apparent vision suggests a fundamental issue with the game's core design. A well-designed game should offer flexibility, yes, but when the most enjoyable experience comes from ignoring the intended mechanic, it raises questions about whether those mechanics were strong or engaging to begin with. Additionally, the suit you unlock in New Game Plus is visually far superior to the base version. The addition of lights integrated into the suit design even evoked the iconic UI health system from Dead Space, which not only looks great but also serves a functional, immersive purpose. This one design choice alone hints at the potential these developers had, ideas that were promising but ultimately underutilized. It's clear the team had some strong concepts, but they either lacked the confidence or the willingness to fully commit to them. Also forgot to mention this because I don't know if it would fit in the gameplay or story section and whether people would consider woke. After the Eliza boss fight in the church, the female protagonist carrying the body of the Pathfinder, a fully grown man, over her shoulder. This is supposed to be a set piece moment, but when it comes to melee combat she hits like she's swatting flies. It's a weird disconnect. Her strength is there in cutscenes or story moments, but it doesn't translate to actual gameplay mechanics. Just shows sometimes games prioritize narrative moments over consistent character abilities. It's important to point out their latest game had a reported budget of 28 million USD. That's a substantial investment, especially when compared to smaller indie horror titles like Signalis, Crow Country, Samurai Unicorn, Nightmare Operator, Echoes of the Living, Ground Zero, and Phase Zero. These games were developed with significantly smaller budgets and leaner teams, yet they each brought something fresh, experimental, or stylistically bold to the genre. Shills are falling over themselves to call Cronos the New Dawn a genre-defining masterpiece, a phrase that essentially means there's not much to do. Much like Alan Wake 2, which was dubiously praised for its narrative ambition despite clunky pacing and a fractured story, Cronos is being lauded for style over substance. Shills are quick to label its vague, meandering plot as deeply introspective and its repetitive mechanics as innovative, conveniently ignoring the thin character work and derivative visuals. A game that feels like a tech demo is being elevated to cult status within weeks of release. If Alan Wake 2 taught us anything, it's that flashy aesthetics and cryptic storytelling can earn uncritical acclaim so long as the right buzzwords are attached. Cronos is the latest beneficiary of that low bar for innovation. The people shilling this game overlooked one important detail, the actual Steam player count, and perhaps even forgot to buy the game themselves. Cronos has a lower player count than the Silent Hill 2 remake and even fewer players than the Layers of Fear. Worse still, Cronos couldn't even outperform the Callisto Protocol, a game widely regarded as a $160 million disaster. That's just not disappointing, it's telling. What this shows is the mainstream audience, or normies if you will, rarely supports games unless they're heavily marketed or already massively popular. Innovation doesn't matter if the hype machine isn't behind it. People tend to follow trends rather than seek out something fresh or experimental. Sad but a consistent reality in gaming. Quality and creativity are often overshadowed by familiarity and brand recognition. Bloober Team, with all its resources, consistently fails to deliver anything that pushes the boundaries of horror or showcase a unique artistic vision. In short, budget and scale aren't everything. Creativity, innovation, and a willingness to take risks matter far more. That's where Bloober Team continues to fall short.